The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team webinar for today. It's 10 o'clock. We're just going to give another minute or two for additional attendees to log in, and we will get started with our discussion. So if you just hold for 1 moment or so, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Again, good morning. Welcome for joining us this morning to the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team webinar. We'll get started in just a moment. We're just waiting for a few more attendees. We'll get started shortly. Thank you. Again, good morning, everyone. Welcome for joining us. We see a number of people that are just logging in now, so we're just going to give it another minute or so to allow them to get fully logged in. We'll get started in just a moment. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team webinar, The Cascading Impacts of Electric Power Outages. This is a web discussion series for regional and cross-sector resiliency strategies. This is part 1, Private Sector Perspectives. My name is Roy Kiley with BCS Incorporated. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I'd like to begin by just giving a brief overview of the webinar process for today. The webinar will run till noon today. We have 9 panelists who have joined us from the energy and lifeline sectors who will be sharing their thoughts and points of view on the energy interdependencies. Only the panel members will have the ability to speak during the webinar. All those listening will not have the ability to speak during the webinar, but we've arranged 2 methods for those listening to participate. First, we'll be asking a couple of polling questions to our listeners and ask them to participate by responding to the questions. Results will be captured in real time, and our panelists will have an opportunity to respond to those results. Second, on the GoToWebinar panel, there appears a tool for questions. Here you can type and submit questions to our moderator team. At the end of the webinar, time permitting, we'll direct some of those questions received during the webinar to selected panelists. At this point, I'd like to introduce Sherry Black, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Plan Lead for the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team, to provide a formal welcome and provide an overview presentation to set the stage for the panel discussion. Sherry, we're turning over control to you for the slides.
Thanks, Roy. Good morning, everyone. I don't know how formal this welcome will be, but I really want to sincerely thank all of you for joining us today. This is the first of 3 webinars that we'll be holding on the cascading impacts of electrical power outages. And this is being brought to you by the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team for the New York, Northern New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pike County, PA RCPT. And we're doing this as part of a very engaging and emerging partnership that we have with the State, Local, Tribal, Territorial Government Coordinating Council, which I'm privileged to chair, the Edison Electric Institute, and the All Hazards Consortium, which is a regional consortium or a consortium of states in the Mid-Atlantic region. So I'm going to now see if I actually have control of this thing. I do. Okay, our objectives are pretty simple, really. To get a better understanding of dependencies and interdependencies across critical infrastructure sectors. And for this webinar series, or today's webinar, and the entire series, the focus is going to be on energy, drinking water, wastewater, petroleum, and transportation. And what we hope to do is identify operational solutions to reduce power restoration timelines and thereby reduce dependency-based vulnerabilities in other sectors. This quote, which I'll give you a moment to absorb, really kind of shows the relatable examples of the importance of energy and electricity play in everyday life. I mean, it's stuff we all know. We get up, the first thing we do is either hit the light, hit the alarm clock, and we don't even think about it, but if we don't have electricity, those things don't work. Probably most importantly, the coffee maker doesn't work. And the whole focus we have here is to kind of highlight the importance of recognizing the dependencies that other sectors have on electrical power. So I'm not even going to try and dissect this slide, but it shows the web of dependencies across all the lifeline sectors. And when we talk about lifeline sectors, we're talking about, you know, those things that provide critical functions in our everyday lives, and that's transportation, communications, water, energy. Some would argue emergency services, and some would argue healthcare and the food sector as well. But we're going to confine our inquiry here today to the ones I mentioned earlier. And each sector is dependent on at least one other sector, usually on multiple sectors. And if you remove one support, you impact and compromise the functionality of other sectors. And we're going to look at those impacts across systems through this webinar series. So this slide shows you the new list of critical infrastructure sectors following PPD8, which removed a couple of sectors. I'm sorry, PPD21. And PPD21 refined the definition of critical infrastructure sectors through that removal. Dependable supply of energy, of course, underpins the operation of all these infrastructure sectors. So PPD21 also embraces for the first time in any of the national doctrines the concept of resilience. Prior to PPD21, the doctrine was primarily focused on protection. So PPD21 defines resilience as the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. Resilience includes the ability to withstand and recover from deliberate attacks, accidents, or naturally occurring threats or incidents. So let's go to the next slide. The RCPT, as well as other government organizations and industry, have conducted a number of activities to improve emergency preparedness and response. What we want to do with this webinar series is use it to build on these activities that we've done in the past and that some of you have been a part of, and identify operational solutions to reducing restoration timelines. The following are examples of common recommendations that have been identified, some of them through after actions that have taken place since Hurricane Sandy by my office here at the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness. Some of you have done your own sector-based after actions, and some of you work for companies that have done their own after actions. So some of the things that we're looking at are targeted communication of weather-related threat information to critical infrastructure, improving coordination and facilitation of fleet movement across multiple states and regions. And by fleet movement, we're talking about, any kind of mutual aid groups that are coming to our assistance following some kind of a disturbance or event. And that could include not only the electrical sector, but the communication sector. We had a large natural gas mutual aid following Sandy, so we're looking at all those things. Emergency liaison officers may be placed in states to help coordinate across lifeline sectors and between public-private organizations, as well as the central information repository for for situational awareness. We're also looking at really practical things like the placement of strategic placement of generators at fueling stations. All those things are on the table right now in terms of things that may assist us in the future in our response. So I'm going to just briefly go through the 3 webinars that we'll be hosting as part of this webinar series. Today's webinar will focus on private sector perspectives. We've got a great team assembled to talk about their experiences, give us the benefit of what they've learned through their years of working in their industries, and also talk to us about some of the things that they think we could be doing. We'll also be learning about what information the private sector needs from the government to appropriately respond to emergency situations, and what actions can the private sector take to reduce downtime. In webinar 2, we're going to turn the tables a little bit, and we're going to have a number of representatives from the government side of the House, and that will take place on May 21st from 10 to 12, and look at the same problems from the public sector side. The last and final webinar in this series is going to review lessons learned. After reviewing the issues from the public sector and the private sector, we'll gather this one last time to look at best practices and lessons learned from previous emergency scenarios. So that's kind of where we're going with this. We are very happy that you were able to join us today, and with that, I'm going to turn controls back over to Roy.
Okay, thank you, Sherry, for that overview and welcome. Appreciate it. At this point, I would like to introduce our panel members. As I introduce our panel members, on the screen you'll be able to see a slide for each panel member that provides a brief perspective statement as well as key takeaway messages from each panel member. Our first panel member is Thomas Bourne. Tom is the manager of Energy Management at Pepco Holdings, Inc. And I'll give you a moment to look at his perspective and key takeaway message. Our next panel member is Ernie Cadiz. Ernie is the manager for delivering operations support for the Public Service Electric and Gas Company. Ernie's key takeaway message is to better understand key obstacles utilities face when dealing with another Sandy event. Next, we have Dean Desautel. He's the manager for emergency preparedness at the Connecticut Light and Power Company. There we have Dean. Dean's key takeaway message is pre-incident coordination and collaboration across all critical infrastructure sectors, especially those identified as lifeline sectors. It's imperative to success of any all preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation efforts. Next, we have Neil Faroon. Neil is the Chief Risk Officer at Conrail. Neil has 4 takeaway messages you can list there, see listed there. Next, we have Jack McCroson. Jack is the manager of Environmental Health, Safety, and Security at Citgo Petroleum Corporation. Jack's key takeaway is understand key resource interdependencies and plan accordingly. Next, we have Jim Nowak. Jim is the manager for emergency restoration planning at American Electric Power. His key takeaway message is a better understanding of how the electric industry approaches service restoration during significant events and how we improve our working relationship to restore communities in a safe and efficient manner. Next, we have Christopher O'Shea, Director of Security and Safety with Passaic Valley Sewage Commission. Chris's takeaway, the events of October 29, 2012 reinforced the important point that no sector or industry suffers alone during a critical incident of this magnitude. Next, we have Scott Perra, Manager of Operations Security at New Jersey American Water. Scott's key takeaway, we'd like to reinforce how critical the water sector is to restoration and recovery operations and promote the importance of power restoration so that we can carry out our mission treating and pumping water. And finally, we have Michael Spall, Department Manager for Emergency Management Preparedness and Liaison for Consolidated Edison Company of New York. And I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for participating with us today and for joining us. And with that, I'd like to get into our moderated discussion. I'd just like to remind our panelists that while you're giving your remarks, if you can spell out any acronyms that you're using for our audience, because we'll have different backgrounds, and everyone won't be as familiar as you are with the subject matter. So if we could spell out acronyms, that would be helpful. And please don't forget to unmute yourselves as you're giving your responses. So with that, I'd like to start us off with our first question that I'd like to direct to Chris O'Shea from the Passaic Valley Sewage Commission. Chris, what are your key interdependencies with the electric sector, either in regards to powering your operations or to assessing other external critical needs? And are you taking any measures to reduce your vulnerabilities to those interdependencies?
Thanks, Roy. To put it in context, Passaic Valley Sewage Commission is one of, if not the largest consumer of electrical energy in the state of New Jersey. The process to transition the effluent to a safe and deployable effluent requires us to utilize about 19 to 20 meg of energy daily. This kind of electrical power can't be supported by stringing together some smaller generators within the plant. Our dewatering systems alone operate 24/7 based on the geographical location and the base elevations throughout our plant as well. And a vast majority of our infrastructure is actually below ground, and these systems are obviously critical. To that end, we're actually partnered with PSE&G here that we own, and PSE&G operates a substation here at the facility, which we are tied to two separate 138,000 volt power sources, the Bayonne line and the North Ave line. So we were, prior to Sandy, fairly secure in our opinion that we had at least two separate power sources coming into the plant. So that would be our true interdependency. As for measures that we're taking to reduce the vulnerability to those interdependencies, short term, we're currently separating out the facility's dewatering capabilities to allow for standalone power short term. The power supply will not operate the process. However, it will protect the plant infrastructure until primary power is returned. In Superstorm Sandy, the dewatering of over 200 million gallons of water was required before PVSC could commence any repairs to bring the facility online with primary and secondary processing. Our long-term goal is we're currently involved in the 406 mitigation process with FEMA in an effort to construct a separate primary power plant on the facility. This power plant would become our primary power, and our current system through PSE&G would be the redundant and backup system should our primary fail. This power system would allow for a sustained processing rather than just a dewatering here at PVSC. Thanks, Ron. Did I lose everybody?
No.
Anybody there? Yes, I'm still here.
We can hear you.
All right, I'm done. Thanks.
Key interdependencies with the electric sector, either in regards to powering your operations or accessing other external critical needs, and what measures are you taking to reduce those vulnerabilities?
Roy, I think you were on mute for part of that question, so I'm not sure the person it's directed to knows who they are.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I was directing that question again to Jack McCroson from CITCO to see what his key interdependencies are with the electric sector and what measures are taken to address those vulnerabilities.
All right, thank you. Yeah, you were on mute. Didn't know it was directed to me. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to fill you in on the situation for CITCO Petroleum. We have a large petroleum distribution terminal located in Linden, New Jersey, just off of the New Jersey Turnpike south of exit 13. The terminal is wholly dependent on PSE&G primary power. In this particular case, during the storm, we had disconnected our primary power from PSE&G to protect the facility should power be lost, and we had to go to generator power and didn't want the primary power to backfeed for safety concerns. Unfortunately, with the storm surge, we lost our main switchgear on both of our parcels on both sides of the turnpike. So we were completely out of luck in terms of utilizing whatever primary power could have been reinstalled or reset in a timely fashion. Even the use of generator power was problematic because of the interior disruption of all of our electrical components. From a dependency perspective, the key is a communication with PSE&G or the power company representatives. As a private energy or a private entity, the key for any private entity is to be able to understand where they fall relative to the prioritization of restoration and service, and having that communication and understanding in advance. The second is to have a backup system, whether it be a pre-staged generator system that can be brought in and utilized to operate even at a reduced scale while primary power is still being restored in the region. And the last key item for us was that in the rebuild of the facility, we elevated the main switchgear internal to the facility to prevent further problems should we see another flood or storm surge along the lines of Sandy. The most important aspect of all of that I want to harp on is the communication. The ability to communicate the status of the power problems that we were encountering, whether they were primary or internal as a result of damage to equipment inside the plant. It was key to get that information back to a central location so that that could be tagged along with all of the other private sector information that the state EOC was receiving. That in turn helped the state authorities to implement a prioritization on service restoration, as well as identify problem areas for emergency response.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate that. I'd like to hear from the electric sector at this point, and I'd like to ask Dean Desitels and Mike Spall from Con Ed to provide their response to what are your priorities to address vulnerabilities associated with these cascading impacts. Dean, if you'd like to go first. Dean, are you there? Okay, can I ask Mike Spall to follow up on that question?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yep.
We're going to do a number of different things. Sandy taught us a lot of lessons. The storm was sometimes 5 times bigger than the previous worst storm, which occurred with Hurricane Irene. So we had over 1 million customers without power during the period starting Monday, October 29th. I think the biggest key takeaway that we had as a company is that we have to set expectations for both our small customers and our large customers. We've got to get out there early. We've got to let them know that we're making decisions that are going to affect them. And some of those decisions may be that as we see very severe weather coming at us, that we're going to preemptively shut down electric networks as we see storm surge coming into the areas. These things are very important for some of the sectors that are on the phone. John mentioned from Citco the need for communications. I can't agree more that the electric utilities have an obligation to major users such as sewage treatment plants, water treatment plants, hospitals, nursing homes, petroleum facilities, gasoline storage facilities. These are all folks that we plan on, and we have in the past, reached out to and let them know what we're planning on doing. Now, where they can help us and where the private sector can help us is that as we see these storms coming, some 72 or maybe even 48 hours before, we're going to need to start moving equipment and people away from the coastline inland to protect them so that we don't have problems getting our equipment, getting our people out to fix wires and pipes afterwards. And that's going to require staging areas, evacuation zones, and things of that sort. And that's where we need the government and the private sector to help us out.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Dean, are you on?
I am. Can you hear me now, Roy?
Yes, thank you.
right.
I'd like to pose the same question to you. What are your priorities to address the vulnerability associated with the cascading impacts?
All right. Thank you, Roy. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak before this audience. Besides the obvious dependencies of lifeline and critical infrastructure sectors on the electric system, I think in the wake of large regional events such as Sandy, probably the most significant issue is the vulnerabilities assessment that needs to be done on a regional level, and really a universal understanding of any of the potential impacts across all lifeline sectors. Historically, most efforts are focused on either state or county level and concentrate on independencies specific to a jurisdiction. Even events such as the 2011 Northeast Energy Assurance Exercise really focused on local jurisdictions to identify and implement those response and mitigation measures. But from my perspective, I think the real priority is establishing a regional view of the vulnerabilities and then establish those expectations that were mentioned earlier for both the mitigation and the restoration priorities. I think the first step to managing those vulnerabilities is really to establish and maintain clear expectations of both the capabilities and the response of the public and the private sector. You know, a perfect example of this is establishing a clear understanding of the terminology, such as critical facilities and restoration priorities.
Okay, thank you, Dean. I appreciate that. At this point, that leads us to our first polling question from our audience. If you look on your screen, you should be able to see the first polling question. We'd like to ask the audience to select their top 2 priorities from this question. From the list of proposed priority action items, please select your top 2 priorities to address. We'll give a few seconds for all our audience members to select their top 2 choices, and then we'll ask our panelists to comment on the results. I'd also like to let everyone know that we will make the slides that were given available after the webinar, and that the webinar is being recorded at this point so that we will look to see how it could be made available in the future for future listening. Let's just give another moment for our tally to come through. Okay, we're just going to wait a few more seconds. We're about a little over 80% of participants have voted. If you can get your last votes in now. Okay, and here you can see the results from our poll from the list of the posted priority action items. You can see the results posted there. I'd like to ask Ernie Cadiz from the Public Service Electric and Gas Company to see if he has any comments on the results that came through.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm looking at the results, and one of the things that we would like to see is the facilitation of the fleet movement throughout the state, especially when we bring mutual aid folks in. Quicker, more smoother transition to get through, for example, tolls and so forth, to get them into our staging areas.
All right, thanks, Ernie. Neil Ferrone from Conrail, do you have any thoughts on the poll results?
No, I kind of the last two, the 43 and the 49%, seem like those are the critical things. I mean, invest in more resilient infrastructure and a lot of training and exercises along all energies. I mean, I'm glad I didn't work in the energy sector during Sandy.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Any final comments, Dean, from the Connecticut Light and Power Company on the results of the poll?
Yeah, I would like to comment. I think in terms of the joint training and exercises, one of the things we have had the opportunity to do in Connecticut is statewide exercises, which has proved very valuable in terms of aligning expectations for large-scale events. In fact, the last year's exercise was conducted about 4 weeks before Sandy. So I agree that is probably a major priority that the industry and the private sector should be focusing on.
Dean, can I ask you what sectors were involved in those activities?
It was all utilities across the state as well as all state organizations.
Were any of the other...
Hey, Roy, this is Jack McCrossin from CIPCO. If I could comment on the results here. It's interesting that the highest percentage is a joint training exercise and a drill. I think it's important to note that the state of New Jersey conducted a hurricane drill a year earlier in advance of Sandy with the petroleum sector, and the issues that were identified in that drill there was ground truth in what we determined in that drill and exercise when Sandy actually hit. So a number of the challenges that we faced, along with the state, were not a major surprise, and we were although we weren't completely covered up and protected, we were certainly not caught unaware of some of the challenges that we were facing, which helped transition from an emergency response into a recovery mode. I think the key is that if anyone does engage in a substantive training and drill program, the other items that are listed here, the level and need of communication, both threat and otherwise, will be identified in the outcome of a drill and exercise. The coordination of fleet movement, the location for information collection and a repository will be identified. So a number of these other items actually fall out of conducting a drill or exercise, and I would suggest that that is one of the most important things to walk away from this webinar with for those who have the position or are in a position to drive that particular issue, is to take advantage of a drill and exercise, because all of these other issues will be identified and will flesh out for local folks during that type of a review.
Jack, if I can ask you or any of the other panel members, who from New Jersey or Connecticut, what lifeline sectors participated in those activities?
In the New Jersey petroleum exercise, it was primarily the petroleum sector that was the driver. So all of the refiners, terminaling companies, representatives of the retail trade, transportation groups were represented at the table, along with all of the key stakeholders from the state.
And
in Connecticut, the lifeline sector is involved. There's two primary utilities and several municipalities. They were all involved in the exercise, as well as the communications and local water companies, and of course all the emergency management, emergency services organizations from the state and the local municipalities.
Okay, thank you. So to summarize for those on the call, from our list of posted priority action items, we had 83% of the participants vote. The top vote getter from 49% was joint training exercises for energy and other lifeline sectors, followed by the central information repository an emergency liaison officer. Third was the invest in hardened and more resilient infrastructure. Next was communication of weather-related threat information at 35%. And our last result was with 31% coordination and facilitation of fleet movement. Do any of the other panelists who would like to comment on the results before we move on? Okay, then I'd like to go into our second question to our panel members. I'd like to direct this first to Jim Nowak from the American Electric Power. What information do you need from government to facilitate restoration and response?
Thank you, Roy. When looking at the question, I broke it down into 3 different areas. We have, I believe what I'd look at is the federal, state, and local. And there's information that could be utilized across or similar across the different groups that I mentioned. But starting with the federal, look at the interstate closure and making sure that we understand what routes are open and closed. And I know there are some websites that provide that, so that is helpful. But making sure that we understand when they'll be restored, what's the estimated time, alternate routes, etc. Also at the federal level, the tolls, that has become an issue, and I know that's also drops down to the state level also. And making sure that we can get fueling. Sometimes we need to have some type of declarations or permitting us to utilize some of the agricultural fuel because it does have a tax exemption. And also finally the reentry, which is really controlled by the state, but it is issued under guidelines out of the federal government with NIMS. Looking at the state, there's some things that are similar, but the big one is the emergency declaration. Most utilities, electrical utilities, will pre-stage. I believe it was mentioned earlier where Con Ed where Mike said they would be moving resources away from the surge area. But really the fact of having a declaration when you're bringing people from several states away prior to an event is extremely helpful. Again, the states are in control of the reentry plan, and there is an exemption for the private sector as being affiliated access, and allows us to have placards, letters of intent, and rosters, but making sure that's understood at all levels and how we can make a reentry. There's really a good communications with the local FEMA group, making sure that we have an understanding of where they're going to be utilizing hotels and staging sites. A lot of times we will get into a hotel and then be asked to leave because it's being taken over by FEMA. We understand that need. Several times we find that those rooms are being held until the event is over, maybe to bring insurance people in or to do some type of assessment. And there's an opportunity for us to possibly use those hotels prior to that it actually being manned. Again, the road closures, the tolls, working with the National Guard with equipment such as helicopters, generators, security, talking lodging and feeding. If we don't use a big logistics company, having that opportunity to work with the state on that. And then, of course, we need to understand the critical infrastructure. What is important so that we can prioritize along with the state as well as local and county, so that we can make sure that we have on our radar what's important to restore, and then we can provide the best estimate for those restoration efforts. And finally, getting down to the local area, a lot of times there is a lot of tree damage, and the trees come down and there's wires tangled up with the trees. Developing some type of process to be able to go out and allow the local debris to be removed without endangering the employees. so that we need to make sure that the wires are removed or at least isolated so that they can remove the trees, the debris, in order to allow traffic flow. Helps both us and also the public. And then finally on that, the critical infrastructure for the local groups. We know we have it at the state level and working on it at the local level with water plants, some county 911s, etc. But that's really the type of interface that we need to continue to grow and work on between the electrical sector and the different branches of the government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Jack McCroson from CITGO. I'd like to pose the same question. Do you have any information needs you have from government or any other needs from the government?
Yeah, I think I'll run off of what Jim was just mentioning relative to the fact that you really have, in my opinion, 3 different levels to address here: local, state, and federal. First and foremost, it's to make sure that your particular industry or infrastructure and dependencies are communicated accurately to those different governmental levels, particularly from an education standpoint. On the petroleum side, there were a number of folks that did not fully understand the fact that even though a particular terminal, an oil terminal or gasoline terminal, had plenty of gasoline and a large storage tank, they were not able to distribute that to the retail stations, where we all saw a lot of press coverage and problems arise at the lack of available gasoline on the street, because the gasoline in New Jersey and the metro area is required to be blended with ethanol. And there was the inability to get that ethanol blended into the gasoline and then distributed out to the street. So that very key piece of information was not clearly understood across all lines of government. So the first piece is making sure that those governmental entities that you're involved with understand your business and your business needs. Beyond that, it becomes a matter, again, of communication and contact. That's where the drills and exercises come into play. Being able to know an individual or a particular office phone number, contact information at a local, state, and federal level for things that affect your particular industry or your facility were critical. And lastly, it's understanding that there are a series of local, state, and or federal rules and regulations that in a recovery and response and restoration scenario may need to be addressed or waived. Jim also mentioned the fact that there were some fuel issues. Well, yeah, there are fuel regulations, both from a tax perspective and a fuel quality perspective, that needed to be addressed, and waivers or discretion authority issued from the government agencies to the industry in order to get restoration back on track. Those, again, are issues that will be identified in a drill or training scenario in advance of an event and can be pre-staged with template letters drafted in advance for waivers or relief that a industry or sector would require from a governmental agency, and those things should be produced or developed prior to a storm event and ready to go at a moment's notice. And the last item is the fact that the emergency operations centers that are located in any particular state, one of the most significant beneficial things that came out of Sandy was the daily call that was held by New Jersey's OHSP director, and all private industry and key infrastructure sectors were able to call in on a daily basis and get an update as to where things stood across the region, which helped in individual recovery activities.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate that. Scott Perra, does the New Jersey American Water have any additional needs from the government as far as information needs or any other needs that could be added?
Sure. Let me begin by saying that during Sandy, as indicated, those private sector calls were instrumental in providing us with the key information that we were looking for. And already mentioned, the water sector is heavily reliant upon ensuring that we've got effective levels of water treatment chemicals and being able to ensure that those deliveries can make their way and navigate to our water plants throughout New Jersey and our other operating states. So really, you know, as far as the transportation issues that we had during Sandy and what the key issue we have centered around transportation, we really need to make sure that the routes of travel the key routes of travels are opened, and we need to be in communication with the DOT and others to ensure that those routes are clearly accessible, as well as opening up the opportunity to travel on roads that are restricted to truck traffic, such as in New Jersey, the Garden State Parkway, and identifying whether those streets are actually open, and if they're closed, where exactly they're closed, so that we can navigate across the state. We also rely on government to provide us what I would call detailed forecasting as it applies to modeling and storm impacts across the state. I do know that during Sandy there were projections on the storm surge slosh models that were provided. You know, I would personally like to see that furthered, and from what I understand, National Weather Service is looking at that issue. I know there's some of folks from National Weather Service on the future webinars that you're going to be conducting, but really to have a tool that we can go to real time to provide basically like a Google map, what have you, that would actually show what the predicted storm surge would be in a certain area. But the resources that we're getting and the information that we're getting down from the government now, I think is certainly beneficial, and we use that effectively. As far as resources, we look under a large-scale event such as Sandy. We did channel resource requests to the government level, both at the county and at the state level, to identify key resources such as unleaded fuel, diesel fuel, and generators, which I think everybody was looking for. We had over 90 generators running in New Jersey across our 5 key operating areas. We serve about 2.5 million customers in New Jersey. And I think that when we started to look at you know, restoration priorities and who was getting these generators, we really didn't get any of these resources through our state contacts. We do have a successful network of operating companies that American Water operates, and we did move generators from as far away as Missouri into New Jersey. And we've made a considerable amount of investments in Sandy and New Jersey to increase the amount of generators we have available. But certainly resource requests at the government level, we looked during Sandy and will continue to look for large-scale emergencies for resource allocation from them. The water sector does have a WARN, a Water and Wastewater Assistance Response Network, which I happen to sit on the steering committee for. Unfortunately, in New Jersey, that WARN just does not have a high participation for whatever reason. And another way of sharing resources, I know the electric sector got very successful related to this come in place, but we don't have that in the water sector, and I would be looking to see how we can promote that and better the participation in the WARN. But that basically sums it up.
Thank you, Scott. I'd like to follow up with Jim and Jack. I believe both of you mentioned listing waivers as part of your response, and I'd just like to ask you or any of the other panel members, what specific type of waivers you think would be helpful in future events like this?
Yeah, this is Mike Spall. One of the things that Jim mentioned, which I think is very important, and I'd like to perhaps just change the focus of it a little bit, is what I call credentialing. In other words, I agree with them 100% about the movement of mutual aid crews with regard to tolls and fueling and things of that sort. However, this storm and previous storms really required us to bring hundreds, if not thousands, of our own employees into the city. And since we are dependent on both the tri-state area to get people from Connecticut, New Jersey, and Long Island, some of those folks have difficulty crossing bridges into tunnels because of the fact that the credentialing issue has not been really ironed out on a tri-state basis, and allowing them to come to work maybe in their private cars just by showing their ID card. So that's one issue we feel strongly about.
Jim Nowak here. And maybe I didn't make it clear, really the fact that the electro industry is not looking for waivers as much as it's looking for how to do it quickly and expedite the movement. If we need to obtain, first of all, we need to do it safely, and we need to meet the transportation rules for weight in vehicles. But if there's a way to be able to pass through weigh stations based on stopping once and having our weight for the vehicle taken and communicated across the travel path between the multiple states. And I realize that the multi-fleet sub-team out of the All Hazard Consortium is looking at ways to make that happen. As we move forward, though, it's that process of getting, and maybe I shouldn't say waiver as much as it should be a way to get from one end to the other as safe and efficiently as possible without holdups from pointing to weigh stations, paying tolls, meaning that maybe it can be billed to the affected company. What did happen on a few occasions until we got comfortable with it, excuse me, we ended up with a group of vehicles going through a toll in the Northeast that came from our Louisiana area, and it was cash only, and we had to produce a little over $1,000 to get the vehicles through. And once bringing that cash maybe for one time through is something we can do, but once we get to the location with ATMs down, banks without power, the community not being restored, getting additional funds to pay to go back and forth through those tolls becomes difficult. So those things help or hinder restoration efforts.
Okay, thank you. Does any other panel members have any additional thoughts that they'd like to add to information needs from the government?
Yeah, this is Tom Bourne from Pepco Holdings. A lot of what the previous panelists spoke about certainly rings true to me. You know, the federal, state, and local strata is all good stuff. I think with a lot of respects, most of the, if not all the utilities, probably have real good relations at the local level, even if local is defined as a city of 20 million in the case of Con Ed, because you need those kind of local contacts just for day-to-day business. Federal, I think we have federal relations, and there's certainly vehicles in place such as the Edison Electric Institute, EEI. You know, there are ways of strengthening our federal relationships. But I think that on the state level, you know, utilities are regulated a lot at the state level, and there's a lot that can happen on a state level that can, you know, affect a utility's ability to restore customers. And it might not be a quote-unquote informational need that I'm going to talk about, but it is a need from governments on the state level. And that's in the large events, the Sandy-type events. We need our state governors to realize that it's a regional approach to restoration, and that decisions that can be made need to be made with a regional flavor and expand the view outside of the boundaries of a particular state. There's a lot of influence that the governor's office can have on the things that happen in a regional approach. So I would hope that we could work with our state governors to kind of broaden the view during restoration. That would be it.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to go to Ernie Cadiz from the Public Service Electric and Gas Company. We heard through a couple of these information needs and comments the need for a regional approach. And I'm just wondering, Ernie, if you have any thoughts on what some near-term operational solutions might be for restoration times and energy outages in a regional approach.
Sure, thanks. A lot of the things that the panelists have mentioned, like Tom said, are direct, impacts on the utilities and our ability to restore. One of the issues that we had in Sandy was, of course, it was the worst storm in our company's history, with about approximately 2.1 million customers out of 2.2 million. But the other issues that we were having were the biggest one, which we ran into, were the fueling issues. And we all know that the terminals being shut down, we could not get fuel. When we started to receive mutual aid support from other states, some of those companies came with their own tankers. And what they immediately saw the issue in the state with the fueling problems that we were having and the other utilities were having, they were actually took it upon themselves to start fueling in Baltimore and bringing up fuel on a daily basis to our staging areas. So that was a major, major problem for us. The companies that came to help us definitely stepped up and resolved it for us. But if we had any more delays, that definitely impacts restoration. The other issue, of course, from our end that we saw from Sandy was, and it's been mentioned already, the movement of vehicles through the Turnpike, through the Garden State Parkway, being held up to pay tolls and not allowed to go through. That was a problem for us because that just slows them down to get to the staging areas and slows them down to get jobs on their trucks to restore. Two major issues there that we saw during Sandy. The hotels that Jim mentioned was not a real problem from us as far as folks being turned away from hotels or because of FEMA and the or insurance companies. But I would say from a PSE&G standpoint, the fuel and the access were two major issues. And to close it out, of course, the storm surge that was not expected, that took out two of our biggest switching stations along the Orthic Hill there, Essex switch and our Bayonne switch substations, which took a lot of our supply lines, 138 kV supply lines down, which impacted about another 40 to 60 substations downstream from that. So those are the three biggest things for PSE&G.
Thank you, Ernie. I appreciate that. Jim Nowak from American Electric Power, do you have any near-term operation solutions that can be implemented through the region?
Yes, I think looking at it from a regional approach and looking at some of the things that I mentioned, I believe the easiest near-term solution is a continued improved relationship between the private sector and the state and federal agencies. First of all, building that relationship and helping an education going both ways, helping the electrical sector understand how the government needs to operate, as well as having the government, state, federal, etc., understand how we operate. What that'll do is that'll open up how we do things regionally. Across the United States, there's 9 regional mutual assistance groups within the investor-owned utilities. They talk and work during national events as one, and they take available resources, allocate them, and move them as safe and efficiently as possible. That near term is if we can help the state and federal governments understand our process, our needs, I think that'll allow us on some temporary basis to get through tolls until a more permanent way can be corrected. Looking at some of the needs that we have, working with equipment needs, we can help figure out what equipment is available so that we can determine whether or not that equipment can be utilized. And I know a lot of this is going on, but I believe it's done individually, and we need to really step that up at a national level or regional level. And there's other things I think we can do to improve a regional response, and that is, and I think it was mentioned by Ernie and by others, that I think Tom Bourne especially was talking about having the states understand how their neighbors are being affected, and so that we can utilize resources or pass resources through the neighboring state, maybe even house them or set up FEMA sites in a separate state that isn't affected, which will allow us some closer transition to affected areas. But I think the biggest thing is relationship building so that we can bring the communities back up. We can put power to a home, but if the person gets in their home and they can't fix the hole in the roof or put food in their refrigerator, there's no use in being there. We got to build these communities and get them back to where they were.
Thank you, Jim. Tom Bourne from PEPCO, Jim had referenced you in there with some of your thoughts. Did you have any follow-up?
The near-term solutions, there's just one added thought I'd like to put out there, and it's about the way the utility business works, that maybe those of us on the inside understand, and maybe we don't do a good enough job of communicating outside of the sector, and that's work practices or restoration processes, as we're talking about it today. They don't really vary greatly from company to company to company across the land. The geography that you have to deal with, whether it's a mountainous terrain or whether it's an urban terrain or whether it's rural or metropolitan, that will dictate what your work practices look like. But by and large, the work involved to rebuild a pole or a pole line or restore service is not going to vary a lot across the company from company to company. So the effects or the improvements on the whole overall process are really going to come from the pre-event mode and the activation modes of the process. And I hope that's what that's a lot about what we talked about today. Like pre-event would be about doing drills and all those interactions between the sectors and between the sector and the government. And then the activation mode is really about we've heard a lot of talk about the movement of fleets and tolls and way stations. Those are where you're really going to get your improvements in the actual process of restoration. And I think that, I would just like to make that point clear. The only other thing that I can think of, and people said drill the process, I think if we could stay plugged in very tightly with what the group is doing on the movement of fleet, I think that would be a perfect opportunity to actually do a drill where we can interact with the state governments and see about trip permits and way stations and and just coordinate all that through that fleet movement group, the fleet movement group. The last thing that I think I'd like to point out is that communications. We've been talking about communications on multiple levels. It doesn't happen just during storms, but how efficient the communications happen during storms is a result of what you do on blue sky days, what we would call blue sky days. So, I think a near-term solution is that, we need to be reaching out and establishing those contacts through venues just like this one, but the follow-up of venues like this with our state and local governments. That's it.
Thank you, Tom. So we've heard from the electric sector and a little bit from the gas. I'm actually curious, Jack McCrossen from CITCO, do you have any additional solutions or anything from the oil side that could be relevant?
Yeah, in terms of near-term solutions, for the majority of the petroleum sector in the northern New Jersey and even over in Staten Island locations, the primary power from the utility was very timely restored. That was not the problem in this particular storm event because the majority of the locations suffered major and critical damage to their interior electrical components, primary switchgear, all their buried conduit, and other components that even with primary power being restored at the street, the facilities were still not able to become operational. So, near-term solution, understand the interior guts of your power distribution system from a perspective of elevation. Know what the flood predictions are, the storm surge predictions, and pull critical equipment prior to the storm. So it's a matter of modifying the preparation plans, the hurricane prep plans for critical sites to pull motors and starters and certain equipment that would be subject to a potential storm surge. And in restoration, a number of locations, including ours, have modified the elevation of our equipment to prevent damage in floods that are sure to occur in the future.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. I'd like to ask our electric power representatives on the panel that a number of the sectors that depend on electric have cited that better communication and timely restoration estimates are imperative as they try to restore and recover from these type of events. And I'm just curious from the electric power reps on the panel, do you have any ideas or near-term solutions to help that communication and timely restoration estimates activities?
This is Jim Nowak. I think one of the important things to do that in the near term is to develop the list of priorities that have the critical infrastructure that looking at trying to restore, and also some insight on the potential for holding off if there's a generator at that location. So if we look at all the facilities that don't have a generator that are critical, and then look at those that have generators, and then possibly what is probably the best amount of time that they'll get out of that generator, meaning if there's a fuel issue, can they go 8, can they go 15, can they go a day or two? So trying to understand not only the priority list, but understand the potential for taking areas or needs within that list and being able to put them off for a little while because there are backups that are running. The potential is that the generator could get flooded and there may be just no way of having a backup. But I think it's developing an understanding of that critical infrastructure list, prioritizing it, realizing if we make every circuit a priority, then none of them become a priority. So there has to be some good communications and development of that list and a plan on how we can attack that. And I think that's a near-term solution that can be done to address the concerns.
Thank you. Any others would like to respond to that?
Roy, this is...
From
Go ahead,
New Jersey
Scott.
American, I just wanted to, thank you. Just wanted to mention that I had to do a significant amount of coordination when it came to restoring our 90-plus sites that were critical sites that had no power. And I think that when we took a look at our current emergency response plans, what we failed to leave out of our facility listings were some key critical information that our 3 main utility companies, Public Service Electric and Gas, First Energy, and AC Electric, primarily PSE&G and Jersey Central Power and Light, we're looking for is account numbers and or meter numbers on all these locations, which we did not have, and it kind of delayed the process restoration efforts and trying to get those locations up and running. And we've taken a good look at that holistically and said, hey, this is key data that we need to have on all of our electric accounts, and even go as far as identifying the line that's feeding that particular location, because many of the the electric companies gives them a better understanding of what line we're being fed off of. So I guess when we take a look at how we're managing these requests and what data we can provide the electric companies when we do have an outage, can actually reduce our restoration time.
Roy, this is Tom from PHI again. It's been excellent comments about priorities and identifying the necessary data that you have to know and all that, and I agree with all those comments. But again, I think there's a piece that probably we inside the electric sector understand because it's part of our business, but I think it would help to educate the other sectors at some other time, but about the whole restoration process, about the methodical approach that it takes to efficiently restore service, and that it's governed by things like damage assessment and resource allocation, but it's also governed a great deal by the construction of the grid itself. And the top-to-bottom transmission, substation, distribution approach that's required to restore, especially in large events. So, I think a whole educational process or educational follow-up with the rest of the sectors would probably be beneficial.
Anyone on the panel have any follow-up to that?
Yes, this is Mike Spall. I guess the only follow-up I would have to that is that damage assessment is very key. I mean, we have to spend in a storm like Sandy anywhere between 24 to 48 hours post-storm after the sun comes out to do damage assessment. And at that time, you can set a global ETR, which will tell you that 90% of your customers or more will be back by a certain date. However, in today's electronic age, what we're hearing from our customers in post-Sandy, and we're hearing it loud and clear, is that we've got to do better than that. So we're looking at enhancements within the company itself, that we're going to go down to regional and even localized ETRs. We're going to make our best attempt to try to do this, and as some of the other speakers said, it's really resource dependent. It's based on the formation and the design of the grid itself. However, we know with people's electronic age we're dealing with right now and in the future, I think we've got to do better with regard to helping people set their plans going forward during a power outage.
Okay, thank you. So we've had a number of panel members throw out a number of near-term operational solutions and how to approach these things at a regional response. And we're starting to get into the conversation of what is it going to take to implement these types of solutions. And I'd just like to turn it over to get some additional thoughts from the panel members on what actions are needed to occur to implement these solutions that we're throwing around the table here. I'm curious from Neil Faroon from Conrail, do you have any thoughts as to how to implement some of these solutions?
Well, I mean, if we're going to implement some of these training and drills, that's going to have to be done at a state level. And not being from the energy sector, I agree with that gentleman that spoke earlier. I don't know what it takes to restore power at this stuff, so I can't speak to that. The training and drills, we do that stuff all the time in the rail industry with first responders. So I think it would be very beneficial, and I think that's something the state needs to take on and get moving.
Does any other panel members have any thoughts on what type of implementation solutions that we can use to access these solutions that you suggested?
It's Tom. The only thing I'd throw in there again is drill the process that the All Hazards Consortium is working on for the safe and efficient movement of fleet. I think it would be an excellent opportunity not only to see what's working, but where we need some improvements and before the next large event happens.
This is Dean Destel. I just want to expand on what Tom mentioned before in terms of education and in terms of preparedness and response activities. And I think there's an enhanced need to expand the communications, even the education opportunities, not only to the general public, but also to elected and appointed officials at state and local levels. Historically, communications and coordinations with the electric utilities has happened at a local level, and I think Sandy and even the storms that occurred in 2011 have showed us that these size events are really a regional event, and the historic parochial view that many appointed officials have taken actually could be detrimental to the restoration efforts. So the need to expand those conversations and the integration of regional plans and even national level conversations, and continue to integrate the private sector into the national response framework. And I think the efforts of groups like this and EEI have shown that these efforts are underway. Even the recent discussion at the White House about classification of first responders. I think it's imperative those conversations continue.
Attorney with PSE&G, one comment with what was last spoken about the education. I think one important thing to consider here is the education at a high level as far as how you restore a substation versus how you restore a distribution circuit. Two totally different aspects of restoration. As utilities know, a flooded switching station with 13 feet of water is not going to be restored within 24 hours. I mean, you are talking about cleaning every single connector in that station by hand. With approximately, we had in that station, I think about 250 FTEs working 24/7, and I think, if I recall correctly, of a 5-day restoration just the Bayway, which was the station that basically affected all the refineries in that area. So that is a vastly different restoration than a distribution circuit restoration. So it's an education process.
Do any other panel members have any thoughts on implementing these solutions that we've been discussing that they'd like to add to the discussion?
Yeah, Roy, this is Jack from Citgo. Everything that we've just heard has been centered around the key infrastructure of the states and the response needs, all of which are excellent ideas. But I think that somebody mentioned earlier that because of today's Twitter and Facebook and media society, there is added pressure on speed of restoration. The one thing I think that we can all agree that we saw on the media coverage of this was the lack of personal responsibility and preparation of the general public. All the efforts that we're talking about now, I think, are prudent, and we all will be working towards making those improvements internally. But it can all be underdone very quickly with a general public that does not take the recommendations of the advance notice seriously. It would be a whole lot easier for us to do what we need to do and get back in business if we didn't have the general public wanting immediate restoration 6 hours after the storm passed. If everybody is able to hunker down and maintain what they need to maintain for 2 to 3 days as recommended, it would certainly take some of the pressure off. So to that end, I think there is a need for federal and state and local governments to improve the public service messaging for homeowners and the general public to take steps to prepare to be without services for a few days. That's probably more of a opinion than it is a recommendation.
I appreciate your inputs. Any final thoughts on implementing solutions before we move on? Okay, at this point I'd like to post our second polling question to the audience. Again, we'll ask you to select two options from the following question on what you think are your top near-term operational solutions. Listed, we have relationship building with public-private sector communities, increase emergency response training and drills, increase resources for emergency and restoration crews, standardize badging, credentialing for emergency vehicles, and understand power system in depth. So our panel, our audience is coming through with their voting. We'll just give a few moments for the results to come through. Okay, we'll send those live now for the audience and panel members to view. So the results are with 70% relationship building with public-private sector communities, followed with 58% to increase emergency response training and drills. Next two are tied at 23%. The first is increase resources for emergency and restoration crews and standardizing badging and credentialing for emergency vehicles. And then with 24%, we have understanding the power system in-depth, evolution, and components. So those are the results of the polling. Thank you, audience, for providing your inputs. Just like to get a few thoughts from the results from our panel members. Chris O'Shea from Passaic Valley Sewage Commission, do you have any thoughts on the results?
Yeah, they fall along the lines that I think they should, Ron. The big issue in New Jersey has always been the credentialing system, and specifically our credentialing to employees as essential employees. There's always been a misnomer in New Jersey as to what that actually stands for. It's really a passable road kind of thing, but if there's a critical event, it doesn't allow you access into that event. And I know the state of New Jersey through OHS&P and the state police are kind of wrestling with that now and how to come up with a better system. I actually thought that would have ranked a little higher than 23%, as it seems to be an underpinning for coming up all the time. We can't really drill, and we can't have that relationship unless everybody's properly credentialed. But you know, other than that, the relationships and the training and drills and really the education of both private sector and law enforcement at the local, state, and federal level as to what parties need to be within an area is critical moving forward.
All right, thank you, Chris. Appreciate your thoughts. Scott Perra from New Jersey American Water, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo Chris's comments regarding the credentialing system. I thought that it would have ranked higher than 23%. I would say that during Sandy we had challenges both navigating, the roads across the state to, I would say, the non-impacted areas, and then certainly had big challenges trying to get onto the Barrier Island and impact. We had impacts there, about 10,000 customers on the island that had no service, and trying to get out there was a challenge during and post-event. I do think in New Jersey there's been a significant amount of opportunities to build our relationships with public and private sector communities, and I was actually surprised to see that so high, because I know there's not just a New Jersey audience here, but there is a lot of good work that's taken place in New Jersey to build that public-private sector relationship, to include information sharing, which we really weren't included years ago when I started in the business, and now we've broken down those boundaries, and we're really getting some good information and feedback from the state and county agencies. So, but that's my comments on the poll.
Thank you very much. Do any other panelists have any comments or thoughts on the results from the polling from the audience?
Yes, this is Mike Spall. I've got a thought. I think it's very important that we make space in the regional EOCs for various organizations. I think that if there's private sector, let's say big box retail stores, and they have a organization they belong to, then perhaps they might be a good person to be at the EOC. The New York City OEM has got space for the hospitals. So I think we should also maybe need space for the petroleum folks. So I think those are ways that you can directly get involved in the emergency itself and have direct access to people right in the room with you who could help solve your problems. And I saw that during Sandy, and it worked very well.
Any additional feedback from our panel members?
This is Jim Nowak. If I do look at, and looking at the top two, it really just tends to lean me towards communications. You know, we need to communicate. So if we build that relationship, if we do the training, and those tend to look at me like that's where the audience, I believe, feels there's short-term benefits. Some of the other ones may be a little longer term. Getting standard badging and credentialing, that's been a struggle for many years, and I know we have addressed it in the NIMS and the revisions of NIMS, but we probably don't have consistency across regions and how that is. So if you bring a crew from several states away, they may get the proper credentialing to go into one location and then get into another after they've been redeployed, may create additional issues. So I think these were near-term solutions, and that may be a longer-term solution. So overall, it looks like improving our communications, which from my viewpoint is not a big dollar ticket long-term and can occur quickly, and maybe that's why we see those two on the top.
Okay, thank you, panelists. I appreciate your response and your thoughts on the results of the polling. At this point, as we are winding through our webinar, I'd like to take the opportunity now to pose some questions that have come from the audience and pose them to the panel for response. So our first question that comes to the panel is, how do you determine the criticality of specific infrastructure? Do you have metrics to allow you to determine that one electrical substation is more critical than another? Please share how you weigh the criticality of infrastructure. I'll open that up to the panel members.
This is Dean Dennisell from Connecticut Lane Power. Interestingly enough, well, we've been going through a lot of efforts following the recent events to kind of redefine what we consider critical infrastructure and critical facilities, and that there's actually a lack of a national level definition to define critical facilities. So largely it's up to the individual utilities to kind of define how they rate different infrastructure components within their system. In Connecticut, what we do is we typically work with the communities and with the state to identify those locations which provide critical either restoration or response assets to the communities, whether they be police and fire, wastewater treatment, gas switch stations, and then we actually prioritize our restoration effort based on restoring the largest number of critical facilities and the largest number of customers.
Any other panel members have any comment on that initial question from the audience?
It's Tom from Pepco Holdings. I'd just like to add the view that, when you talk about infrastructure, there's, our infrastructure versus the rest of the sector's infrastructure, so you could look at it two ways. But I'm going to answer from the other infrastructure point of view. I really think that the criticality of any set of infrastructure sort of varies from incident to incident. I don't think it's set. While there are lifelines and those kind of criticalities, I can give an example from after one of the hurricanes. Schools. If schools had to open up the next day, it's critical because it's critical to people's lifestyles. If you're in the middle of the summer and schools aren't open, that criticality goes away. So I think it's fluid and dynamic and local in nature in most cases. And I think what can work well is to funnel up those different viewpoints of critical through something like a county OEM or your OEM structure, and then have a good working relationship between the OEM community and the response community. I think that's one viewpoint that you could take. As far as the criticality of our own infrastructure, I think that's pretty well been determined on a day-to-day basis because you have to operate the grid. And to operate the grid with its inherent redundancies and things like that, the criticality of any one piece of infrastructure is pretty well set. And it varies from place to place. That's it.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'd like to ask the panel members that the disruption of fuel supply and equipment has been mentioned many times as a problem across the region. Do any of the panelists have any other examples of how power outage disrupted other supply chains or prevented their accessing essential supplies for their operations?
There are situations in some of the coastal events over the last 10 years where damage has also affected some of the ports. They've affected some of the airports that are close to the coastal area, so the ability to bring in resources through the air, whether it be supplies or people, become difficult. I haven't heard too much about rail, but one of the things that occurred was I-10 during Katrina, and then recently through Isaac, ended up being flooded or damaged, and that does stop or create alternate paths. So there have been a lot of effects on the infrastructure that has created issues for, I think, all the people on this call as well as the audience.
Any other panel members have any response on how the power outages disrupted other supply chains and prevented accessing to essential supplies and operations? Okay. Okay, so I'd like to ask the panel, how do we get the public to prepare for power outages? What has worked and what has not worked so well for you? Any takers?
Well, it's Tom from PHI. Let me throw this one out. I will say Facebook and Twitter. if you're not taking advantage of social media these days, you're missing a very, very powerful mode of communication with the general public. And, you know, I know at PHI we do a lot on Facebook. It's not just a storm method of communication. It's a blue sky type of communication. So I would say, you know, look at social media. You can't ignore the impact of social media.
This is Ernie with PS. We agree here with that 100%. The other thing to consider is the message that we put out prior to Sandy actually hitting us. We actually put out, you know, global ETRs prior to the event of 7 to 14 days, and we were doing that also via social media. At times, it's, you know, you put out that type of global ETR and people just fail to accept it. That's another issue.
It's Scott Power from New Jersey American. I just wanted to echo that we effectively used social media during managing the event during Sandy in New Jersey. We had communication staff in our Emergency Operations Center in Voorhees, New Jersey, constantly monitoring Facebook and Twitter. We have a social media policy that handles exactly how we transmit and what information we put on Facebook, and it was well received and very effective, and particularly providing information to those homeowners that had homes along the barrier island.
This is Jim Nowak with AEP. I couldn't agree any more with all the comments, and it's something if we need to continue to address, and as social media continues to grow and avenues or processes change, we need to see how it can fit into our communications with our customers and our stakeholders.
This is Mike Spall. I agree completely with all the other folks about social media. The only thing I'd like to add is with regard to hard-hit communities, places like Broad Channel and places like Coney Island and Far Rockaway. I think that those communities really need to have base truth, really set up localized command posts with city agencies, with other agencies, in order to reach out to those hard-hit communities.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that. I'd like to direct the next question to the panel. A number of you have mentioned throughout the webinar the importance of educating both the government and the public, and this seems to be done company to company. So I'm just curious, are there any comments on how educating at the national level rather than company by company might be beneficial? Any comments on that?
This is Dean Disno. One of the things that we're looking at is, you know, at the national level, when you have the entire energy sector involved, you really have a constant message that can be presented. And one of the things we're looking at is, you know, opportunities with additional partnerships through EEI to engage some of the federal and even state level government agencies, you know, to provide that message. All too often when you try to engage at the local level, and then New England is really the perfect example. You have such a large density of electric utilities that you sometimes lose the continuity of message when you try to do it locally. So I think it's very important that we try to engage, you know, national level organizations such as EEI to make sure that there really is a consistent message and that really everybody understands the magnitude of some of the concerns that the industry has.
It's Tom from Pepco Holdings. I would add that on the federal level, you know, if I understood your question right, Roy, it was about the education at the federal level. I really think that as the sector lead, the Department of Energy, and as a sector representative, the Edison Electric Institute, EEI, I would really look at those two as having the lead when it comes to education
at the federal level, and in partnership with utility leaders.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your comments on that. I'd like to ask the panel members, which of the panel companies on the panel have liaisons assigned to local or state emergency operations centers, and how is that role of that liaison person defined?
This is Jim Nowak with
We
AE.
do have liaison staff at the ROC here in New Jersey. We also have liaisons at the county OEM offices, all 11 for PSE&G, and those roles are defined to relay any critical issues that are arising from those county or state levels back to our command center here in Newark on an event like Sandy, so we can properly address the issue and mobilize a crew or the right personnel to that location.
All right, thank you, Ernie. I appreciate your comment. Jim, I think you had a response as well?
Yes, I was going to say, as a more rural utility, and I realize that the Northeast there are some areas that are rural, but mostly very populated and urban or metropolis. When you start having multiple counties, in our Ohio area we have 88 counties, serve roughly 60 of them, it becomes difficult to put a point of contact in each one of the county emergency centers during the derecho. Pretty much every county in Ohio had outages, as well as our West Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana groups. However, it's extremely important that those emergency centers have a point of contact. So when we have a more rural area, we provide a point of contact with backups so that communications can be made from an emergency operations center at the county, local, and then we start providing an actual person in the locations at the state level, or if it's a very heavily affected area and possibly one of the larger cities. So I think you got to look at the nature of the event and how widespread it is, but it'd be great if you could put one everywhere. That's not always practical because those resources can become better utilized in the field and helping with the restoration efforts, as long as you still provide, and I think it's very, very necessary, provide a point of contact.
And Roy, it's Scott Parra, New Jersey American Water. During Sandy, we effectively deployed key personnel from the water company at 3 of our 12 county EOCs. We found it very effective as part of our after-action report, or internal AAR that we did. It was determined that we really have to deepen the bench, so to speak, in order to staff a prolonged emergency such as Sandy. We primarily are doing that with operational risk management folks, and we're looking to deepen the bench with our engineering, non-essential engineering folks that aren't really out there handling the restoration efforts and other non-essential positions within the organization, and providing them the training they need in order to act as the liaison within those county EOCs. So we definitely think it's important. We do serve 12 counties in New Jersey alone. We didn't staff all of them, but we did staff 3 what I would call more adversely affected counties in our service territory.
Roy, this is Jack from Citgo. For the petroleum industry, during Sandy, there was representation of the petroleum industry, not an individual company located in the ROC state EOC. That person became the point source person for distribution of information, both from the field as well as from the ROC back to the field as necessary. And that would be the recommendation that, and somebody mentioned it earlier, I think it was Ernesto from PSE&G, that having a representative at the state EOC, whether it be for the individual company or representing a particular industry sector, is a key takeaway.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Does anybody else on the panel member have any additional information related to their liaisons in the emergency operations centers?
Yes, this is Mike Spall. We provide a liaison to both New York City Office of Emergency Management and the Westchester County EOC. We are also providing liaisons to 39 communities within Westchester County itself. Those folks are now going to be staying not only through the cut and clear operations immediately after the storm, but through the restoration efforts in order to keep those communities informed about the restoration process itself. Those folks are being trained right now, and we're reaching out to those communities to set expectations with regard to what those staff will do and will not do.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that. We have time for one final question from the audience here before we move into our wrap-up. I'd just like to ask the panelists, can advanced technology, such as automated feeder switches, smart meters, or other technologies, help with damage assessments? Any thoughts?
Chris O'Shea, Passaic Valley.
Okay,
you know, the damage assessment, I mean, a lot of the panelists are spot on today, particularly for, you know, our case here. Earlier that, you know, power was restored within, you know, a day or so here, but we couldn't get to any of our primary infrastructure because it was all underwater at the time. It's interesting on how to assess the damage, and I'm going to throw this out. We're going through the process, and as most people are with FEMA. FEMA has their own way of assessing damage. You don't really know about it until they come and sit with you and try and explain it to you, how they assess cabling and switchgear and what's repairable and what's replaceable, and the difference between fresh water, salt water. I think any technology that could quickly assess damage within the facilities, power-wise as well as infrastructure-wise, is necessary. I would just caution that whatever mechanism we start using needs to be approved from FEMA going forward, because we could spend a lot of money on that technology, and then it may not bear fruit should we have another disaster of this scope when FEMA comes and they don't recognize the technology on how to reimburse for repairs or what they consider a repair to begin with.
All right, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that that feedback. At this point, I'd just like to thank all our audience members for providing such a large number of questions. We apologize we can't get to all of them, but I appreciate your engagement throughout the webinar and participating in our polls and submitting your questions. Many of you have stayed on through the entire time, and it's appreciated. At this point, before we wrap up with final comments, I would just like to ask the panel members if they have any final thoughts that they would like to share around the table before we go into closing remarks. Panelists, any final thoughts of the webinar?
Roy, my only question would be is if we did have some, you said the response was back, we had a lot of questions that were unanswered. If there's specific questions geared to any one of the panelists, is the information going to be shared with those folks so they can follow up directly with us?
We will look in. Yes, we'll look into that, and we will try wherever possible to direct any specific questions to panel members or others and make those connections as best as possible.
Other than that, it was a great 2 hours, a lot of good topics, a lot of good discussion, and it's certainly beneficial.
Any other panel members with any concluding thoughts or key comments they'd like to make before we sign off? Okay, then I'd like to then thank Sherry Black and the RCTP team including Laura Stockstill. Sherry and Laura were key and instrumental in organizing and putting on this webinar series. So we'd like to thank them both for their efforts in putting this on. Sherry, do you have any final comments you'd like to share with us before we leave?
I'd like to thank all the panelists who gave us their time today. I thought it was incredibly enlightening, and not only was it great for what we were trying to do here today, it actually feeds into a number of other efforts that are going on in other places. So really appreciate the candid feedback and the good suggestions that you had, and we will try to build on those over the next 2 webinars. The next one is May 21st, and I hope some of you will join us, I hope all of you will join us at that webinar when we'll be turning the tables and talking to government stakeholders about how we can hold up our end of the bargain. So again, I just want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the audience for their very enlightening questions and for their attention today.
All right, thank you, Sherry. And I, too, would like to thank the panelists for their participation and their remarks and their cooperation. Just one final reminder, those on the line, to join us next week on Tuesday, May 21st at the same time for our second panel discussion where we'll focus on the government perspective. And with that, we will sign off on Webinar 1. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good afternoon.